Welcome to Widemindedness with Victoria Ball, the podcast in which I interview expert guests who want to join me in celebrating that life is not black and white. Our society is increasingly divided, and the us versus them mentality seems to dominate our conversations and relationships with others. I believe that life is much richer when we widen our minds to consider multiple opinions and perspectives. So challenge your assumptions and let's become truly wide-minded together. Dr. Daniel Wehrenfennig is the Executive Director of the Olive Tree Initiative, an award-winning experiential learning program based in the University of California system and housed at UC Irvine. He also directs the certificate program in conflict analysis and resolution and serves as the Vice Chair of the Chancellor's Advisory Council on Campus Climate, Culture and Inclusion at the University of California, Irvine. He wrote his Ph.D. about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, comparing it with the conflict in Northern Ireland in the context of citizen involvement in the peace process. His personal travel and work with the Olive Tree Initiative has brought him back to the Middle East over 25 times in the last 15 years, as well as to Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, Colombia, and Northern Ireland. Dr. Wehrenfennig has also produced a documentary film for civic education in Malawi. He has created programs that study diversity issues in the United States and educate high school students on diversity and inclusion. Thanks so much for joining me. Can you tell me a bit more about the Olive Tree Initiative and why you think it's so important for students to understand different perspectives in conflicts?
In 2007, when I was still a graduate student at the University of California in Irvine, there was a lot of activism happening around the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I myself, with a number of community members and faculty, started discussing this idea of traveling together to the conflict zone, to the Israel-Palestine itself. In 2008, started his first trip as an experiential learning trip to learn on the ground. Idea was that everybody could bring to the table what they thought they needed to say and see and what the other side needed to see, but also had to accept to engage the perspective of the other. Students came back, completely transformed in some cases, confused, in some way found what they were looking for, but in many ways did find other things that they were not imagining, and kind of this multiple perspective and also being immersed yourself in the issue by traveling there made a huge difference. Then I got hired to run this whole initiative and bring it now to 12 campuses. And the core is still the best way to learn about conflict and conflict resolution, especially if you have very deeply held beliefs, is by going, seeing, experiencing yourself. It's being overwhelmed by the complexity and by also the visceral contextualization of feeling, smelling, seeing, experiencing, and seeing that this is an important issue, not just something that happens in your opinion or that is important in campus politics, but people's lives are at stake, and that things are not as black and white as you often think. Really allows you to come back with a much more evolved perspective. Most people, I don't think, change their opinion, who they believe or what they believe, but they have a much more deeper complexity of an ability to hold multiple opinions at the same time and also to understand their own perspective much better, to engage the conversation with each other more, and then also like to deepen it more on the issues that are really relevant for people in the region.
The reason I loved the Olive Tree Initiative the first time I heard about it was that it creates an opportunity for students to immerse themselves headfirst in seeing that the world is not black and white. Is there anything we can do in our day-to-day lives to widen our minds, to engage with people who hold different opinions?
That issue is so important, and is something that I've been thinking about a lot. And last year, I put some of my thoughts together in a TEDx talk I actually gave. Are you fit for conflict? Very often, we want to have, or we need to have, these different difficult conversations, these experiences of engaging each other, of widening our minds, of challenging ourselves. But often we also, I think, are not quite ready for it. We often know that we physically need to have some workout routines, and it also takes time to train ourselves to get ready. If you start to work out with a really, the very first day you go back, or you start to work out and you pick up a very heavy bar and you just try to do it and maybe hurt yourself, it actually can have the opposite effect. That if you try too much, too early, and have that context, a too difficult conversation too early, it may hurt you. So what I try to do is, in this kind of awareness, is saying, look, we need to get ready. We need to be fit for these difficult conversations because they're so essential and important to have. So what can you do daily? One is read news, but not just the news you like, but different ones. It's a very easy task that I ask all my students to do all the time. Read news from different sources, especially ideological different sources. If you speak a different language, please read news in a different language from a different country. Perspective taking and understanding how other people around us may look at the same thing that we believe is so clear and truthful and as clear as it can be. By just reading the news from a different angle, from a different perspective, you will find out that people can, look at the same issue in a completely different way. The second thing is something I find very fascinating, and the older I get, kind of learn more and more in different direction about it, is intergenerational conversation. So I would challenge everyone to, at least once a week, talk to someone who is 20 years different than your age, 20 years older or younger, and just share or talk about the daily news or what is going on, and just understanding how we have completely different experiences and generational experiences. Right now, we're in this terrible crisis with the corona crisis. People who have gone through crisis, older, generations, have a completely different ways to deal with that, in a good way and a bad way, But they have experiences of dealing with that, and it can allow younger folks to understand of what is it, that we experiencing right now, to put it in context, and vice versa. I think people who have gone through that but quite don't understand the reality of what it has to younger people right now, and what they go through is a really good exercise to do that. And it's an easy one, and it's not difficult, something to do that. The third one, I think, it's maybe the most challenging in a weekly context, which is find somebody you like, and hopefully there's somebody in your life you do, or at least somebody you're close to. Could be a family member, and we know with everyone that we're in a relationship with in some way closer, that there are issues that we may disagree on. And our normal responses are that we talk about anything but those issues, because we don't want to hurt the relationship. We don't want to make it difficult. It's too straining. It's, we just want to, feel good about it. However, I think in this context of learning to deal with differences and becoming a better communicator, and a more well-rounded, person and citizen in that context, we need to have difficult conversation, especially with the people we are in a relationship with. Because sometimes it's so easy to have a difficult conversation, or just to shrug somebody off, or to, curse somebody out, of being really, oppositional to someone that you can walk away from, on the internet, on a, anonymous platform, or in whatever, you're meeting at an event and you don't want to see that person again. But it's much harder with people that you're in a relationship with. And that's the reality of our life, that we need to learn to have difficult conversations and to affirm differences with the people that are close to us. And just to do that and to lean into that, I think, is a very important exercise. But if you do those three things more often, I think you're getting more used to being confronted, to deal with the emotions of that, to deal with your own perspectives about that, and then to be able to have much more harder, difficult conversation on extremely, core issues, maybe to yourself, religious beliefs, gender identity, the politics, with in a bigger sense, personal things, money, whatever it is, that are very hard for you to talk to in general, but even harder to talk with someone who has a different or challenging opinion to that. But I think it's essential for us to learn that, in order to live with each other and also to grow as humans.
Daniel, you've made so many brilliant points there. I'm buzzing with questions I want to ask. I'm so pleased that you mentioned the point about intergenerational, because I feel that maybe when we discuss divisions in society, that's often one that we tend to overlook. We sometimes talk about gender, about race. What are the major causes that you see for division in society?
I think I would say the US conversation about race is much different than the European one or the German one. Um, However, I think the underlying differences, as you mentioned, the intergenerational differences, is something that's difficult to put your finger on, but it's actually a reality that is very often overlooked. And for many years, intergenerational living that used to be a norm, meaning people staying or living in the same houses than their parents and their grandparents, has decreased dramatically. The points where different generations meet or engage with each other in different contexts of social gatherings or others are less and less and less. The other thing that also I think is an overlooked difference is the difference of income inequality. um, Especially here living in Los Angeles, it is staggering the differences what one block to another can have, in the reality of people's life, and how people in their perception and in their need and where they are very often more closer to people in a similar income reality than they are in based on race, gender, religion, and other identities, especially right now in this crisis. The people who lost their job and live paycheck to paycheck live a completely different reality than most other of us, and we can have a hard time understanding that, or understanding, what $1,200 more or less, in the paycheck from the government does or doesn't do. So I think there are definitely stark differences. But in the end, and I think you kind of mentioned it in your question, when it comes to the bigger concepts of differences, it may not make a difference where and how you experience these differences, because they're there and they're individually felt. For you, they're there, meaning some issues that I may think are a major difference, which may be your income or which may be your age or your religion, may not felt as different or as important to you than other identification for yourself. So there's a lot of differences, and I think it's more kind of the question: what matters more to you in some way, and which are the core issues that are you much more affected by? What are the issues that you have a much harder time to acknowledge, to be vulnerable about, or to discuss? And I think those are the ones to think through and to lean in some way.
Like you, I've got an academic background in conflict resolution, and we often look at political settings of conflict either within a state or between nations. But what your answers so far have so brilliantly shown is that conflict exists on micro and macro scales. And what do you think are the biggest barriers that stop us from seeing someone else's perspective?
The biggest barrier is the absence of relationship or sharing space with each other. The real game changer very often is the relationship the other person perceives, or that you're in. Is it a space that is, there's trust? Is it a space that can build trust? Is it a space that can, really create openness and vulnerability? Can it be a space where somebody really opens up or acknowledge that they may know not as much as they said they do, or that they're willing to, consider something else? So the biggest barrier is to create spaces, that are productive. And I don't use the word safe, because very often it's still not safe, for you to do that. But productive spaces that there's enough willingness and trust and relational, kind of capacity involved to make that happen.
6 in 10 people recently said in a study for the BBC that they feel that the society they live in has deeper divisions than 10 years ago. Our society is becoming more divided. And what do you think causes that?
I think it's a combination. Yes, I think as a society becoming more opinionated, there's less models of people out there, in the context of leadership that shows compromise, that shows reaching, over the aisle, changing their opinion. There's less examples of that in our, entertainment, in our life in general, having different opinions, and modeling how to agree to disagree and all of this. But I think the other issue that also plays a big role in all of that is that we spending less time, or going back to the muscle and the training, of places that we learn to hold different opinions at the same time. Meaning, feeling that opinion, that 6 in 10 people feel they're becoming more opinionated, has also to do that you feel like if there is something presented to you that is different from your own thinking or thought, that you immediately have to make a choice to combat it, change it, or double down or dig in your own opinion, versus allowing in your mind, in your communication, or in general, to let it stand there alongside of your own thought and opinion. Meaning this ability to hold that tension of multiple different expression of differences, of multiple different expression of opinions, with not ultimately feeling like you have to engage in kind of categorizing it, or in presenting something different, or oppose it. And I think our inability to hold that tension in our individual lives, family, society as a whole, has also caused this idea of that on anything, on any issue, that we need to kind of have an opinion. You normally hear people immediately jumping to a side and connecting it with the pre-existing larger frame of reference of like, oh, this is came from this and this person, and because this and this person has done this before as part of this group, this needs to be disqualified. It's immediately trying to put things into this black and white, into these pre-existing notions of larger identity groups and opinions, versus allowing to hold that. So I think the decreasing ability or training or reality of being able to hold things at the same time has as much contributed to this perception, and in some way the reality, that we're becoming more opinionated, as I think has in general the trends of polarization, missing leadership, and examples of that.
That's exactly what I wanted to ask you. I wanted to ask if it was wishful thinking to think that we are able to disagree respectfully.
I feel like we are confronted with a choice, or a basic ability to look at the world in two ways. One way is we all becoming more similar. If the world as a whole becomes more similar, and we are erasing differences, and we all kind of believe in the same thing, and we're all striving for the same future, and have the same understanding of politics, religion, gender, race, anything you mention, and then I think the need to learn how to disagree is not as important, because I think ultimately it's kind of the world is bending to a similar combined focused version of the world, where disagreements will disappear because certain mass truths will come out of it that we just plug in. This worldview is very few people believe that, or there's very little reality. So it's more like, I think, the second, which is that we as a society, as a whole, are becoming more and more expressive in our differences, individually, in groups, in many ways. The pluralistic project is, I think, is succeeding. We develop in some ways more sensitivity to people's different people's races, gender identities, religion, political opinions, whatever it is. We're learning to read people more carefully, this idea of tolerance, of learning that people are so different on so many multiple levels, not just the one or two or three that we used to think about. I think it's moving forward. And if this is true, and I think it is true, and I think we're still moving in that direction, not just in the West, but everywhere, that this pluralistic expression, and allowing also with social media and different things to express ourselves much more individually, and this need that individual, expression also needs that I'm different in so many ways, and kind of express that and find ways to do that well. But that also creates a reality that is not optional, but is actually mandatory, that we learn to live with those differences, that we learn to how to respond or deal with that somebody's individual expression, somebody's truth, ultimately conflicts with my expression and truth, because that's just logic. And if we are not learning that and pushing in that direction very strongly, but are not learning and more kind of still on this project of disengagement of people of differences, then this idea of a society of us coordinating, living together, and making choices for each other, with each other, is not going to succeed. And it's actually very dangerous. And so I think this idea of learning to disagree, to be respectful, to allow, to hold that tension, to be living with people that we know are differences on key issues of my own identity is essential for the future of this world and our society to exist and to thrive. For me, that question is so essential, but it's also not a kind of optional. It's kind of a mandatory project that we engage and have to engage in and have to think about right now.
I think you've just put it so brilliantly. It's essential for the human race.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot, I love also this context, I love and I will start to use that term, wide-mindedness. I think for me, that means, that having a wide mind that holds a lot of things at the same time and that lives in this tension and lives in this differences and engages them, and I think it's a wonderful, important concept that is absolutely needed for today.
Thank you so much, Daniel Wehrenfennig, for joining me. Your great wisdom, your practical tips, they're just brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode of Widemindedness with Victoria Ball. Help others learn about it by rating, reviewing, and subscribing. For more great wide-minded content, follow @Widemindedness Victoria Ball on Instagram, @Widemindedness on Twitter, and sign up to the monthly newsletter at victoria-ball.com.